Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. In my late teens and early 20s, I was a venture scout and leader for my trips with a local Boy Scout troop. I'm a female, but my brother was part of the troop for quite some years, and I became friends with everyone there. I completed my youth protection training and was allowed to lead and chaperone camping trips and other wilderness-related activities. I had a longtime friend in the troop. Let's call him Sam. He was a close friend of my whole family. Sam was a little bit older than me and had already been a Boy Scout leader for several years. This story takes place in November of 2018. Sam and I led an upcoming camping trip. The annual fall canoe floats down the Buffalo National River in Arkansas. The Buffalo River runs about 135 miles through the Ozark Mountains, with enormous bluffs on at least one side or the other for just about all of it. It flows through some of the most beautiful parts of the northwest and northern areas of Arkansas. Despite my incidents, I still encourage you to take a trip there. That afternoon, we made camp on a riverbank about 15 miles from where we put in. The scouts put up their tents about 25 yards upstream of my tent, with the campfire and cooking station between us. As I set up, I told Sam I was a little nervous about sleeping in my tent alone for the first time. He shrugged me off and told me I'd be okay, and that sleeping alone was relatively peaceful. I remember rolling my eyes. Unlike me, Sam had not only been camping utterly alone for years, but he had also done it in a hammock with no other protective gear, what I would consider essential. I didn't bother to ask him to tent with me because, according to the scouting rules, males and females cannot share tents, and I didn't want to get in trouble for the first time leading a group. However, I think Sam sensed my unease and set up his sleeping arrangements outside my tent, consisting of a sleeping pad on the ground with his canoe flipped over the top of him like a coffin. Still, I admired what it must be like to live with so little concern. We all spent the evening around the campfire, talking and making dinner. The forest and the river were so full of life, and I felt a little more comfortable when we all decided to turn in for the night. I watched Sam lay down on his pad and flip the canoe over him, and then, sighing with contentment, I climbed into my tent. I spent the first hour or two reading while listening to the sounds of the boys up the river fade as they all fell asleep. But I couldn't, for the life of me, fall asleep myself. The nighttime temperature had dropped below freezing. Then, of course, I needed to pee. I probably spent another 10 minutes trying to trick myself into forgetting about it and just falling asleep, but it was nearly impossible. Finally, I exited my tent, tapped Sam's canoe to let him know where I was going, and headed up the bank for some privacy. I don't know how many women on here have peed in the woods, but if you have, you'll know it's one of the worst things about camping. What made it even worse was that I was cautious about being seen. I climbed up the embankment, walked about 10 feet into the woods before stopping, and oh my God, it was miserable. Not only having to drop drawers in the cold but also being completely vulnerable. But the worst part about it was that it was completely silent, not a single cricket, not a rustle of a squirrel, nothing. It didn't really click in my head until years later how bad that was. It was just that primitive part of my brain started screaming to leave immediately. I ran back to the dam, sliding down on my butt, and sprinted back to camp. Once I was back around everyone else and in the glow of the full moon, I had a little more sense of security. The river was quietly burbling, and I could see the dying embers of the campfire before I got the idea to take the warm rocks from the fire and put them in my sleeping bag for some warmth. I dragged about 4 or 5 decent-sized stones into my tent and slipped them into the bottom of my sleeping bag. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. I was awake for hours in pain from how cold I was, trying to rub the ache out of my legs. I remember tearing up because of how exhausted and cold I was. That's when I heard a noise, like footsteps walking around downstream from my tent. The bank was covered in smooth river stone, so any footsteps would make quite a bit of noise, but the sound of the rocks shifting told me that this was something rather big. Then I heard it enter the water. Worried that one of the boys was awake and going for a midnight swim, I quickly unzipped my tent and poked my head out to see a magnificent elk drinking from the river. At least, it looked like an elk. It was massive, but far enough away and standing perfectly in shadow that I wasn't quite sure. It was much too large to be a deer, but we don't really have moose in Arkansas, from what I know. I quietly watched it, hoping to see more of it when it looked directly at me. Its face, even in the shadow, triggered my primitive brain again. If my blood wasn't running cold before, it was now. I felt a pricking up my neck as if some unknown terror crept into my bones. I ducked my head back into my tent and stayed still for hours. The combination of fear and cold wasted any hope of sleeping. I never heard the elk leave the bank, but I didn't even think about listening for it. I was just so wrapped up in the moment. The woods were almost screaming in silence. After what seemed like hours, someone tapped on my tent and said, "Come on, it's time to go." I pressed my face into my hands and breathed a sigh of relief and exhaustion. I had made it through the night, but even though it was over, I didn't get any sleep. I quickly stuck my feet in my boots and exited my tent to find nothing. It was still night. I had confused the light from the moon with dawn. No one was around my tent, and the time it took from when they spoke to me and when I came out was not enough for one of the boys to return to their tent before I saw them. That prickling feeling returned, but this time it was all over my body as I heard a voice say, "Don't turn around." I slowly sat backward in my tent, zipped myself into it, shaking. I laid down in my sleeping bag, covered my face, and prayed. I prayed for so long until I finally fell asleep. In the morning, I woke up to the familiar voice of Sam talking to another scout outside my tent. I could feel the warmth of the sun beating down on my tent. I knew I looked terrible, because Sam did a double take upon seeing me. "Jesus, you look like you didn't sleep. Did you come to my tent last night?" I asked him. Sam, still studying my face, slowly responded, "No. Please don't play with me. If you did, you got me good, great. Just don't continue that joke night after night, please." I felt a little bad being accusatory, because Sam was a pretty no-nonsense guy, especially when it came to being in charge of camping trips. "Diana, no, I wouldn't try to scare you. I know how nervous you were about sleeping alone out here." He folded his pad before tossing it into his canoe and throwing it over his shoulder. "But I guess you weren't too scared last night." I looked confused. Sam gestured up the embankment into the woods. "I heard you making a few trips up there. Next time, get a Gatorade bottle, so you won't have to leave your tent or anything. It'll save you some time." Around that time, the rest of the scouts had announced that they'd finished cooking breakfast, and everyone had migrated to the campfire. But I felt like I had just sunk my knees into the river mud. I had left the tent, and I had gone up the embankment, but I only did it once. So, if it wasn't me, and it wasn't Sam, what did he and I hear coming out from the woods and checking out my tent multiple times that night? And why did he hear it more than I did? I've told this story to multiple people before, and they say I probably just dreamed it. But I know I hadn't. I had been too cold, sitting in my sleeping bag most of the night. I'd always dreamed of hiking the Appalachian Trail. It had been a goal for as long as I could remember, and I was finally going to do it. My boyfriend, Dylan, was supposed to pick me up at around 6 a.m., but by 7, he still hadn't arrived. When he finally showed up, I was more than ready to give him a piece of my mind, but his laugh, as always, made me smile. We reached the trailhead, and I leaped out of his Jeep before it fully stopped. "Slow down, Tess, wait for me," Dylan said. We started down the trail, taking in the fresh, clean air of the forest, though something didn't feel quite right. Dylan seemed to sense it too, but didn't say much. After about 2 miles, we heard something overhead. I looked up just in time to see a huge branch fall. Dylan grabbed me, and I narrowly avoided being crushed. It didn't make sense. There had been no wind, nothing that could have caused it to fall. "Someone dropped that limb," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Tess, no one's up there," Dylan replied. We brushed it off and continued to our chosen campsite, near a beautiful stream. It felt serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Dylan teased me about being paranoid, but I knew something was wrong. Later, as we were washing our dishes by the stream, I noticed something on the opposite bank, an old, dilapidated cabin. It gave off a distinctly evil vibe. Cobwebs draped from broken windows, and the door swung open on rusted hinges. "Dylan, don't go in there," I shouted as he made his way toward the cabin. He didn't listen. Minutes later, he came stumbling out, pale as a ghost. "We have to leave now," he said. He didn't wait for me to argue, he just packed up our gear and yelled for me to do the same. I had never seen him so terrified. We walked for miles in the dark before he finally let us stop. With his sidearm and rifle close, he pulled me close and whispered, "There was something in the cabin." It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Its arms were too long, its nails like claws, and it was eating a deer, alive. Dylan's voice cracked as he described the creature, its sharp yellow teeth dripping with blood as it smiled at him. Tears welled in his eyes. Suddenly, he shouted, "Run!" I turned, and in the distance, I saw it, the creature had followed us. Shots rang out as we ran for our lives. The last thing I remember was collapsing somewhere along the trail. When I woke up, I was in a park ranger station. They told me they had found both me and Dylan scratched up but alive. We had no explanation for what we saw that night, but one thing is clear, the Appalachian Trail can be a dangerous place. I believed in monsters or demons, but only after my two best friends and I encountered one. We were about 13 years old, living in rural northern Florida, down a long lime rock road that backed up to a swamp on the edge of 80 acres of protected woodlands. Leo, Steve, and I often played near a small family-owned cemetery at the forest edge. Our house was only about 100 yards from the cemetery, and my mom would usually come out onto our porch to holler for us to come in for supper. Now, we weren't being bad out there. We were taught to be respectful to the dead. However, the edge of the forest was where you could find all the best sticks and rocks that boys like us loved to play with. There was something about the broken brick wall that separated the cemetery from the woods that really enchanted me. There was a 15-foot section where a car had blasted through it one night and it never got repaired, so that was our access point. We had played there countless times before, but we would never play there again after that night. Like most late afternoons while waiting for supper, we walked over to the cemetery to mess around. We had been out there for quite a while, going back and forth from the woods to the cemetery, wasting time wrestling, tossing stones, sword fighting with sticks, just the usual fun. The best place to get sticks was a large brush pile where the cemetery staff would toss the debris after cleaning the grounds. It started to get dark, and this old road had no street lights. We waited for my mom to call us in for supper when we suddenly noticed an awful, foul smell that seemed to come out of nowhere. It smelled like rotten meat and feces. We all acknowledged it but couldn't pinpoint its source. Moments later, my mom called out to us from behind the cemetery wall, near the woods. This wasn't necessarily uncommon, as she would occasionally sneak up to scare us. But something felt off. It wasn't her usual holler, she just said my name, once, plainly. All three of us ran to the hole in the wall and looked down the path, but we saw nothing. The smell lingered, but there was no sign of my mom anywhere. Leo was the first to suggest we should go back inside, but as soon as he spoke, we heard my mother's voice again, clear as day, calling my name from beyond the giant brush pile. Steve, being the bravest of us, called out, "Miss Marie, you ain't gonna scare me," and charged towards the pile to try and startle her back. But before he had taken more than a few steps, we all heard my real mom's voice calling us back to the house, from the opposite direction, 100 yards away. "Boys, y'all come in. Supper's ready." We froze. The voice we had just heard was unmistakably my mother, calling from home. We turned back towards the brush pile, and before we could react, it exploded with movement. A loud, otherworldly shriek erupted from it, the stench intensified, and we all scrambled to run home. Something was behind us, coming fast. We reached the hole in the brick wall just as my dad, armed with a shotgun, came running full speed down the road, having heard Leo scream. We jumped into the bed of the truck just as my mom pulled up in the driveway, clearly alarmed. My dad demanded to know what had happened, and in a panic, we all frantically described the creature and the horrifying experience. After a few tense moments, my dad decided to investigate. He led us back to the cemetery, where we saw a brown and black trail of a slimy, foul-smelling substance oozing from the downed bricks. The trail led back to the brush pile, where we had first sensed the presence of something much worse than my mom playing a prank. Though it took a lot of convincing and several months of avoiding the area, we eventually returned to playing in the woods again. But whatever that creature was, something that could mimic voices, something foul-smelling and fast, was the most terrifying experience of my life. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.